Dot, 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 dot. Good morning, everybody. This is Grant from State of the Spark, here to encourage you today for today's show. Please fly closer to the sun. Yes, we're going to cover false myths and how false myths can be really debilitating. And how do you actually get a myth false? And then how strong myths, accurate myths, can actually take you to the next level. So we're going to be covering that a little bit today. And we only have some fun facts for other news. Two very interesting fun facts, which of course we'll cover these fun facts. One is just going to make you cry and weep into your pillow if nothing else has, in the most delightful of ways. And the other is actually a small piece of crypto news, which is interesting. But before all of that, you know what time it is. You know it's time for a morning cup of gratitude. What are you grateful for this morning? What are you absolutely grateful for this morning? What has got you up at night thinking, man, if I could only get more of this in my life? And I'm going to start with morning cup of gratitude. Grab that cup of Dro, get comfortable, grab a blankie or whatever it is you need to do. And let's talk about what we're grateful for a quick moment. I'm grateful for my morning studies. I love my morning studies. They enrich me. They give me insight to different parts of the world. I believe it was Bob Proctor that said, a house without books is like a home without windows. How can you look out into the world if you don't read? And so this morning, I am mega grateful for the direction my studies have brought me. They've brought me all over. And we're going to talk a little bit about this, about scattered thinking, focused thinking, but around the concept of a myth, and a myth that you're probably familiar with based on flying too close to the sun. But there's a myth underlying the myth that I think is super empowering, which we'll talk about. But that's what I'm grateful for, how my studies have wound me through all things crypto and financial freedom and personal development and technology and web. And hey, that's just the amalgamation called me. Deal with it. And we're going to talk about other news. What are you grateful for? Tell me in the comments. Let me know what's got you hyped. Let me know what's got you pumped. And let's talk about other news. So, having fun with nihilistic facts. You see, when I was a kid and I first saw, I don't know what I saw. I don't know if it was the original Battlestar Galactica. I don't know if it was whatever the scary red HAL computer movie was. Whatever it was, I got petrified of black holes early on. And someone please look up the definition or the word for fear of black holes. As a kid, I had a morbid fear, a mortifying fear of black holes, that our universe would get sucked into a black hole. In fact, when I heard this fact that black holes have a gravitational pull so strong that not even light can escape, I actually started having nightmares about it because I love my freedom. I'm a freedom-oriented person. And this idea that there was just an unseen gravitational power that could get its little hooks in me and pull me, and I could never escape. And that petrified me. It horrified me. Well, fun fact, Alex Cecilia of Italy, fortunate last name, Cecilia, and yes, that's their name, in Italy at the International School for Advanced Studies has actually calculated how many black holes there are in the universe. There are 40 quintillion black holes. Now, you can't fathom this number. You have to see it visually, and I'll have the link for you. But how much is 40 quintillion? It's a billion billions. And the math estimates roughly go, there's roughly 40 quintillion black holes in the entire universe. And they say that this makes up 1% of the universe's ordinary matter. Now, physics education, you have to specify, are we talking about dark matter? Are we talking about regular matter? Are we talking about freaky matter? What are we talking about? 1% of the Earth's ordinary matter is made up of this 40 quintillion, a billion billions black holes, things that could suck you down like the horror from nightmares all over. Now, what's the likelihood that our planet or our galactic neighborhood gets sucked into a black hole? Very little. And that's just to give you a brief insight into how absolutely astounding and awe-inspiring large our universe is. If you would like to stay up at night with the fear of black holes, Boom, there's the link in the comments. You got it. Gift from me. Here, there we go. Boom. There we go. Whoop, I put it in the wrong one here. Let's put it in this one. There we go. Boom. There you have it. My link upon links of 40 quintillion, a billion black holes scattered throughout the universe so that you could stay up at night and wonder when you're going to get sucked into one. What is the name of that film? What is the name of that film? I want to call it Black Hole, but it's not. We all know it's not. I'll post about it later. Let's talk about a small piece of flying too close to the sun in the crypto universe. Yes, there is a crypto game, and this defies, if 40 quintillion black holes defies the mind's ability to fathom, then metaverse probably makes you scratch your head as well. And there's a lot of interesting things going on. Again, watch the show or check out my YouTube videos if you want to talk about the metaverse in depth. But in this piece of other news, you have to fathom this. If it's hard to fathom how large the universe is, and thinking about 40 quintillion black holes makes up only 1% of the observable universe, and if that will never actually, or not in any foreseeable future, or realistic foreseeable future, suck our solar system or our galaxy into a black hole, like never. That's how big the universe is. If that boggles the mind, you need to know that there is a metaverse game. This is how big the metaverse is. This is how big crypto is. There is a crypto game that you've probably never heard of called DeFi Kingdoms. Yes, it stands for decentralized finance, DeFi Kingdoms, and I was messing around with it. It has an 8-bit Adventures of Link sort of feel. It's got little message boards, and it's super fun. But in this piece of crypto gaming world, it makes up 75% of all crypto gaming, which is huge. And there's a good article I have for you here to show you the gameplay hours. It's crazy. But the interesting thing about this game is it has very real in-game banking mechanics. So if you've been following any of my other YouTubes, you know that there's ways to make crazy amounts of returns, and those are up and down and sometimes sideways and sometimes not doing anything at all. But in this game, there's actual banking mechanics. You see, the game is trying to attract new borrowers, just as any real bank would. And within the game, you borrow money and you get little power-ups and little stuff like this. But from a very real perspective, that bank within the game needs to have real deposits. So if they're going to pay out real rewards, that game needs real deposits. And for there to be real deposits, they have to reward real investors incentives to put deposits in their bank. And in DeFi Kingdoms, you can earn right now around 350% return on your money. Now, whenever we talk about these returns, it's not financial advice. This is what I'm experimenting with, as I always say in the Patreon or elsewhere. But it's very interesting, and as we've seen, these things don't last long, right? I had one that was paying out 60,000% a year, and it actually technically still is, but its price is really low, and that's crazy. But in this game called DeFi Kingdoms, if you were looking for a place to put your money, other than the bank and inflation losing 13% a year, there are other places to put it. And I would present for your consideration to look high and low in the crypto space. And this is just one that I'm looking at right now. I'll probably do some videos for the patrons and the Discord on that later. But if you're just curious about how many people are actually even using this thing, boom, there's the link in the comments below. Check it out. This article kind of goes into usage and to in-game monies and to in-game usage. You can always check that out, DeFi Kingdoms. And I would categorize that as maybe if you think you can get 350% or 65,000%, maybe you're flying too close to the sun. If you're familiar with what that myth means, we're going to actually break down why this is a false myth or why this myth can be false. And the power of true myth. Let's talk about it today. So have you ever had a grand idea? I was just sitting with a friend this week, and we were talking a little bit about the people closest to him are often the ones to say, you dream too big. And I've been accused of that so often, in fact, that I quite often only share a fraction of my dreams with the people in my life because I just get so exhausted with the naysayers and people saying, hey, you're flying too close to the sun. Now, where does this myth come from? Some Greek god built wax wings for some unknown reason, and placed them on their back or placed them on their feet, depending on the myth, and flew and were so intrigued and enamored with the sun and so arrogant in their desires that they flew too close to the sun. And as they approached the sun heated up and melted the wax wings. And as some of you know, this god fell, or this demigod fell from the sky and was killed or injured. And as Greek myths go, they appear in other myths later down the line. But in this particular myth, they were killed or harmed. And the watchword says this, and the false myth says, here's the myth. Take it as a rule that if your ambitions are too high, you'll get burned. The very support with which you flew to the sun will melt beneath you and you'll fail. And that's the pervading message of this false myth. So, can you get a myth false? How do you get a myth false? Well, quite often I tell people myths can never be false in a different context. And what I mean when I say that is you can never get a myth false because when you purvey or share a myth, that myth hits the ears of the hearer when delivered correctly. The speaker does not interpret the myth, the hearer interprets the myth. Therefore, when a myth is told, or a fable or a parable is told, the listener listens and then listens with intent to gain wisdom. And they find that wisdom for themselves and they basically interpret the myth. You can get a myth false when that myth begins to carry a cultural baggage with it that has a continuously applied meaning. Myths need to be culturally shared, but the meaning is meant to shift in and out of time. Quite often, Christianity has had a hold on society for many thousands of years, especially Western society, in different forms. But there was always a shared myth, no matter how the theologies were interpreted, no matter how the historicities were interpreted, there was generally these shared symbols or icons that were basically ubiquitous throughout a culture. Well, these myths are starting to wane. As the Christian religion starts to wane societally, it's growing stronger in some certain areas, but it's growing massively weaker in terms of its global hold. In general, shared myths, especially in a world where we can look at our phones and be distracted, and shared weight in sobriety when a myth is shared. The somberness and the sacredness within which a moment that a myth is shared, these moments are no longer around us. So we're not sharing these myths. Now, what is the real myth? And this is why we call it a false myth, because as you hear about this story, quite often this myth is attributed. Do you know? I'm going to give you 3 seconds or 5 seconds to tell me in the comments which myth or which hero or demigod I am referring to. The one that built wings out of wax and flew too close to the sun. I'll give you 5 seconds to tell me. Most often we refer to Icarus. Icarus was the god that built wings and flew too close to the sun. But quite often what we forget is this myth was part of a bigger myth. And that bigger myth went something like this. The king of Crete loved Daedalus and wanted Daedalus, depending on who it is, but I'll just say Daedalus. The king of Crete was enamored with Daedalus and wanted to keep Daedalus on the island of Crete. Now, we won't venture into other myths and tangential myths here, but what we'll pretty much say is this. Daedalus, wanting to leave and escape, could not escape, and had his son, Icarus, with him. And Daedalus, wringing his hands, not knowing what to do, was a craftsperson, was an artist, was what we would know today as a Renaissance Greek, a Renaissance person who was into all sorts of the arts and all sorts of the sciences and all sorts of the philosophies. And the king of Crete wanted to keep this person as his own advisor, vizier, and he wouldn't let Daedalus go. At his wit's end, Daedalus, it is written in the Metamorphoses by Ovid. It is written that Daedalus then turned to unknown arts. Daedalus turned to the unknown arts and crafted for himself and his son a set of wings. And Daedalus, putting on the wings for he and his son, flew up and flew away and escaped the island of Crete. It's only later that you introduce the character of Icarus flying too close to the sun for his arrogance. The reason that that's a false myth is many people apply it into not striving for more. Quite often, when you're an artist, you're a creative, you're a visionary, you go into other areas of your mind. You have your one thing. I don't know if you remember from Billy Crystal's City Slickers. Curly waved one finger. Billy Crystal turned to Curly and said, and Curly was the wizened, sun cracked, old cowboy. And he seemed to have this salt of the earth wisdom. And Billy Crystal turned to him and said, "What's the secret of the world?" And Curly epically held up one cowboy gloved finger and said, "Find your one thing and do that." And Billy Crystal kind of laughed about it and parted ways and disregarded it. But this phrase has reverberated, believe it or not, in a very cheesy 90s film, maybe late 80s, early 90s film. It's reverberated through philosophers since then. Modern philosophers has referenced this piece of pop art, if you will. In terms of philosophy, the philosophy simply is find your one thing. And this is the pervading wisdom. Don't get too distracted. Don't go into unknown arts, unseen mysteries. People often quote King Herod from the Bible, "Much learning doth make thee mad." Keep it simple, son. Focus on one thing. And there is a massive amount of wisdom in focus. But I only paint that as cultural context to talk about the application of false myths. Myths are powerful. And a false myth comes along and says, be careful you don't fly too close to the sun. Now, the most common application of this is arrogance. Don't be arrogant. What they don't say is don't build wings and don't fly. What they say is don't fly too close to the sun. And this is the myth that's been handed around. And we forget that myths and meaning are nuanced. They're not cut or dry. So I will summarize with this. You get a myth false by making a myth dogma, by leaving out the context, by not telling the whole story. If you would have told the whole story that Icarus was enamored with the flying wings, his father's craft inspired Icarus, and Icarus flew many places. Icarus is known as the messenger god in many situations where he wielded it for so much good. But there was just a moment, a small moment, where arrogance and overconfidence empowered Icarus to fly up, yes, too close to the sun. And if you told the whole story to a person in your life, that person might not be dealing with arrogance. Maybe the person is dealing with applying their parents' invention to their own life. Or maybe it would have pricked another thought inside of the hearer. But you get a myth false when you don't know the whole story. Because if you told the story of Daedalus, you might talk to someone who is an ADD business owner like me that says, hey, Grant, you can be like Daedalus. Explore unseen arts, get into crypto, explore unseen arts, get into Patreon, explore unseen arts, get into esoterica, go study things that are outside of Christianity. But when you do, make sure you craft something useful so that you can escape the prison of your mind, the prison of commerce, financial freedom. That could be an application of the myth if you knew the whole story. The warning to an ADD person like me is being fooled that it's your own genius. Being fooled that the things you invented are genius. I think Peter Saka, or one of the venture capitalists, was recently said, oftentimes when we succeed, we attribute it to our genius. And when we fail, we attribute it to luck. And we need to learn to invert that process. When you succeed, please attribute it to luck. When you fail, attribute it to your own oversight and disorganization. That's a good warning for an ADD person for me. But if you just handed me a false myth and didn't tell me the story, I'm willing to learn the lessons of life, and I think you are too. But if you're just purveying false myths or myths that have been so entrenched that they are now dogmas, you're missing the power of a true myth. And a true myth is pure symbol and story told with the solemnity and a sacredness so that the hearer enters into that sacred moment and then interprets the myth in a convicted way, a way that convicts their own heart. So when I reread the Daedalus and the Icarus story of Daedalus and Icarus escaping Crete by Daedalus wielding Unseen arts, you could call these dark arts, or you could call these magic. So recently, if you're in our friend circles, you know that we've been asking crazy questions. We've been talking about tea ceremonies and plant medicine, and we've been talking about meta-Christian concepts and intra-Christian concepts, looking for answers to level up our marriage, level up our business, level up our mental freedom, level up our financial freedom. And this is what Daedalus did. He wielded all the dark arts, and then he flushed the unnecessary, focused in on the thing that was useful and helpful. And this is what we do. We step way into the dark, deep mysteries, and we come back and bring these secrets for our communities and our loved ones and our friends. And we help ourselves strap these wings to our back and escape the prisons of our minds, the prisons of society, the prisons of commerce, to experience the freedom to live, which, as you know, if you study any of Joseph Campbell's work, or I was just enlightened that there's also a heroine's journey, or a character's journey that's not just masculine hero's journey, but nearly to a person, the last phase is always the freedom to live. Icarus has his own myth, and we could talk about Icarus pro and con myths, but if we don't know the full story, we can't use the power of that myth. Yes, there are myths of people making money in crypto, and then there's the reality, right? We heard about the myths of people driving Lambos and visiting us in Miami Bitcoin conference back in 2017. Yeah, there's plenty of myths, but there's a reality too. And can we apply that reality to us? There's the myth on TikTok of people making millions and millions through their Airbnbs, and then there's the realities. The trick and the purpose of today's message is not to debunk the myth, not to not believe the myth, but tell the full mythological story. Open your heart so that you interpret it rightly for you, and so that it empowers you to take action pragmatically around you. The purpose and power of a true myth is a comprehensive story with comprehensive principles that no one interprets but you and the people intimate with you who are interpreting that myth in order to take action, not in order to limit action. The false myths are dogmas that are often shared to cause someone near them, maybe even with a heart of protection, but to cause someone near them to limit their action. Listen, I hope this has meant something to you. Like or subscribe, check it out, share it with a friend. But no matter what you do today, remember the mythological mission, igniting lives of explosive significance, starting with your own. Have a great day.